upon us in overwhelming numbers. Still, we fought on, availing ourselves of every stone and bush as we retired. This was a quote from Rifleman Harris on his memoirs and recollections of the Peninsular Campaign under the command of Wellington in the Napoleonic Wars. So this was part of the campaign that was led to the liberation of Portugal and eventually Spain. Most of the allies consisted of Portuguese soldiers, British soldiers, obviously, as well as a lot of Spanish guerrilla fighters. And one of the big problems I personally think that Napoleon had in Spain was that he was never there. And the Spanish really hated his brother. His brother was a very bad choice to put on the Spanish crown. And, it was just one of those things where it really did not work out for him in the long run. But one of the things that ultimately changed, I think, had a fundamental change on the war was the terrain. If you go to, and I encourage you to do this, go to Google Earth, go to Google Maps, and go check out northern Spain. Specifically look at Lisbon in Portugal, look at Badajoz, and some of the other big terrains and battlefields, Salamanca. Look at the surrounding areas around there, and it's vastly different than the battlefields of continental Europe, where Napoleon's armies had seen nothing but victory and domination for the most part. It was one of those things where you had to break your armies up a little bit. You didn't want to spread them out too much or face disaster like the Allies did multiple times, but you had to give free rein to some of your trustworthy leaders, and to specialized units for that. The grasshoppers, and they were called this because the riflemen wore green jackets and they carried Baker rifles that had almost twice the range, but they were given a lot of freedom in this campaign because the main role was to disrupt the French supplies, disrupt French reinforcements, continue to chip away at the little bit of hold that the French even had in Spain. And the easiest way to do that is a level of asymmetrical warfare, or asymmetrical warfare is such a modern term that I don't like it, but like non-traditional warfare of the time. So, in the time period, you've got line warfare. Everybody lines up, they shoot at each other, they fix bayonets, they charge, and whoever's men are braver and more lethal are the ones who win the day. Not to mention the artillery, the cavalry, and things like that at the time. But realistically, it was everybody line up and shoot at each other. And that's not to be dismissive of it, because it takes a good pair of grapes on a guy to stand there and know that there's a line of trained troops across from you shooting at you. And at this point, most of the troops on the French army, they've had lots of experience, and there were a lot of veterans in there. So, but going back to it, the terrain of northern Spain and Portugal and the area kind of around it is ultimately, in my opinion, what led to the rise in skirmish warfare. So the French, they had chasseurs and voltigeurs. The British, they had their normal light infantry, which were, they were line infantry regiments, but they carried less equipment, they moved faster, and they were more maneuverable, but they weren't riflemen. Riflemen were specialized troops, specialized equipment, who had specialized missions, often miles ahead of the main army, doing what we call, still to this day, screen lines. So, in my time when I served in the U.S. Army as a cavalry scout, we would do like defense and screen, or we would be a screen line in front of a tank column or infantry battalion or anything like that. And what it is basically is we are broken up to cover a large front and spread out in a way and used in a way to detect any kind of enemy positions, whether it was enemy defensive emplacements, enemy scouts, whatever it was. And so a lot of times in this period in Napoleonic warfare, you would have riflemen and voltigeurs going up against each other, but your voltigeurs, they were marksmen themselves, but they used the Charleville, which was still just a musket. It didn't have the range or the accuracy of the Baker rifle. It's actually one of the things that I'm looking into right now as to why Napoleon was such a stick in the mud about rifles. And so, you know, riflemen were valuable in the sense that they were also experts, because the Baker rifle, it took a leather patch instead of a cotton or linen one. It had the rifled barrel to it, obviously, which those wear out over time on campaign. You fire enough rounds through it, they smooth out, and you need to get a new barrel, you need to get new firing pieces, things like that, and you have to prioritize these things. You know, it's one thing to need 1,000 new Brown Bess muskets versus, you know, hey, I need specific precision rifled barrels for these Baker rifles. So you have these two major things with it, and had Napoleon or his marshals been a little bit looser in the way that his skirmishers fought and equipped them better, you may have had a different outcome. But I truly believe it was the terrain and the mobility that the riflemen used and were used in is what led to the liberation of first Portugal and then Spain. You know, your rifles, these were guys who were taught to advance and use behind cover. You know, you're sitting out here with me now. This is, you know, this isn't flat terrain. I'm in the woods here on the back of the property, and you know, you're using stumps, you're using trees, you're using folds in the ground and things like that for your reconnaissance operations. And so you're able to gain intelligence, gain information. You're able to do more ambushes. You're able to eliminate specific officers. You're able to eliminate supplies. You know, you let the cavalry escort by, but you shoot the guys who are manning the wagons with all the supplies. Animals go buck wild, you know, chaos happens, and that's really what you want to cause. You're trying to cause as much chaos for the enemy as possible while not having as much chaos for yourself. So I've got my notes here. You know, that was a bit of a ramble, but I've got my notes here to talk about it. But yeah, I've already kind of talked about it, the independence of their movement and their use of terrain as a force multiplier. So yeah, let's say that, because they're, like I said, go on Google Earth, pick any part around Salamanca, any part around the Pyrenees, and you know, the portions of Spain where these battles were fought, and you're going to see that terrain can be a huge weapon. I mean, even here where we're at, modern hunting uses it. You know, you use the creeks and the draws. You look at the valleys. You look at the hills and the knobs and the beds and the mesas to see, you know, what's the highest probability of where my enemy is going to go. And realistically, especially when we're talking about disrupting supply chains, they have to use the path of least resistance. You know, they're not as mobile as individuals going over this. Like, let's be realistic here. If we had a supply wagon coming through, it would be on this roadbed, not 20 yards, 30 yards to either side. And so, you know, using that terrain, it makes gives your men better cover. It gives them a higher level of lethality, but it also gives you a higher level of information. So let's say that we're not looking to engage let's say it's a reinforcement column moving through here and not supplies. And our riflemen are on order say like, hey, don't engage it. We just want to know where they're coming through. And we know that it's this road. Okay, great. That lets the rest of the main army know without the enemy even knowing they're being observed, like, hey, this is where they're reinforcing from. This is how long it should be. This is the time it should take. Here's where we can slow them down. You know, something like this, you drop some trees across this, an infantry column is going to be slowed down a little bit, but a wagon train is going to be slowed down a lot. Our artillery train is going to be slowed down a lot and make it an even easier job. And you do that enough to an enemy, between the riflemen, between the Spanish guerrillas, between the Portuguese infantry, their skirmishers, you start to wear on the mentality of them as well. So now on top of, you know, having to prepare for the big battles, right? The big attacks, the big sieges and things like that, they're also having to be wary about just moving from point A to point B. And it's not just because, oh, there's cavalry attacking or things like that. It's, you know, you're a French officer with your men, and at any point you can be shot, right off the back of your horse. There's nothing you can do about it, and there may be no warning. And realistically, that unit of riflemen, by the time the French get in range, the voltigeurs get in range to counter them, they could be gone. They could have picked off and wounded or injured or killed more French soldiers or officers, or they could have just dipped out and left. So the psychological effect of that had to have been astronomical, which again, the majority of, you don't read about attacks like that, you don't read about skirmisher use like that in a lot of other places on the continent. So that's what makes Spain so unique, is it was the first time that you really see a high level of guerrilla warfare. Austria didn't really do that, Prussia didn't really do that, but Wellington and his trust of his men, along with the aid of the Spanish guerrillas for teaching them the terrain, it really created an advantage that could not be beaten. To this day, modern militaries struggle with. So, we already kind of talked about the terrain and the choke points and, the advantage of skirmishers. But what we did too is, the Baker rifle itself being a specialized piece of equipment, the max range on it, or the effective range on it, was almost double the muskets that were used by their French counterparts. So your skirmishers, you're going to have more of them. Oftentimes there were more chasseurs and more voltigeurs per unit than there were riflemen, but you were losing quite a few of them even as they move from cover to cover, just for them to get within their maximum range. So then you're in your maximum range. Your maximum range and your effective range are two very different things. Yeah, max effective range on a 7.62 rifle is like 800 meters. That's max effective range, but realistically, or max range, realistically, that doesn't mean I'm going to be the most accurate. Now you're talking about smoothbore muskets. Like, that takes it even into a whole different level. And so your skirmishers are getting killed. They're being shot. They're being wounded. The guys who are, less than willing to keep getting picked off by these riflemen, they're probably stopping and picking up their wounded comrades and helping them back to the line, which is, it's a good thing to do, but it's also something people would do to get out of the fight as well. And so then, you're losing your good men, and it becomes an almost even fight by the time that the French get in range. And then the British can just skip away. They break cover, especially if you're talking about high ground like this. Like, if you start getting shot at from these woods on this hill behind us, and you're down here, you've got to get up to this. By the time you get from here to there, bounding behind cover and returning fire, they could be back down the other side. And once they crest that hill, they know they can't be shot if you're still down here. They can run at full sprint, not worried about cover, and get to the next hill line and repeat as far back as they want to go. And that's why I chose this quote from Rifleman Harris, because he talked about, even though the French were coming in overwhelming numbers, still we fought on, availing ourselves of every stone and bush as we retired. So even though it was a desperate fight, even though they were outnumbered and I'm sure scared, they still stuck to their training, they stuck to their skills, they stuck to what they knew how to do, and they knew that they could play this game. It was a risky game, it's a gamble, it's warfare, people die, it's always going to be a risk, but there is a level to it of when you're like, it's rinse and repeat, we're going to continue to do this, we will kill and wound them, and some of us probably will be killed over time, but this is our game. And when you're doing things like that, and I kind of talked about this with disrupting supply lines, disrupting troop movement, not only that, you could be setting up, larger ambushes that effectively eliminate entire enemy columns. Let's say that your rifle, Wellington, in several occasions, Wellington's rifle units or other light infantry units detected French movements or French supply columns, and then they would set up with regular line infantry and blocking forces, and the French would get stuck because of the terrain. They would get sucked right in. And then what are you going to do? You're in a ravine, you're stuck in a choke point, even inside towns you could do it, especially if they're using wagons to move supplies and stuff. You're able to slowly squeeze them out, and the French on top of this are having to maintain a level of security and control over the entire rest of the country, which is slowly starting to fight back. And we've read in Wellington's notes, and we've read in other problems, the whole issues that they had with the Spanish guerrillas, and how a lot of the guerrillas fought more frequently than the Spanish military even did against the French. But the French were trying to fight a insurgency on top of trying to defeat one of the most competent military leaders of their time. And it's wild to think that this is something had never happened to them before. Anywhere on the European continent, they overcame. Napoleon usually was the leader, and they won their battles. They continued to dominate all over the globe, and realistically, they weren't beaten. It got to the point where even with Wellington, once Napoleon was on the field and it was the European continent, the Allies would only fight the battles that Napoleon was not in charge of the army of. If they knew that he was in charge of the army, they withdrew, and somewhere else they attacked. And so there was a lot of this spider web of problems, I think, with Spain that really stemmed down from Napoleon putting his brother on the throne and never really focusing on it himself. He was worried about so many other places. And it was just very interesting to see the effect of this type of warfare. When we lived in Sicily, it's wasn't the same, obviously, because we're on an island in the Mediterranean, but we're not that far away. And you can understand looking at the hills and looking at the rolling terrain. And even when I was stationed in Korea in the army, that was just mountain valley, mountain valley, mountain valley, mountain valley, mountain valley, and then a city, and then mountain valley, mountain valley, mountain valley, mountain valley. It was such a wild aspect of everything that terrain, in my opinion, at this time and period of war, terrain gets really written off a lot. There are some battles throughout history that terrain gets attributed to, like at Agincourt and the muddy wheat field and things like that. But for the most part, it's a simple note of at Poitiers, the English had the high ground with hedgerows, and that's kind of what it's left at. When you look at these campaigns in Spain, and I think what helped Wellington in Spain understand the use of the brutal terrain was his time in India. There were multiple palaces and multiple places that he besieged that if you were there too long and monsoon season came through, your encampment is flooded, your men are getting sick, and then on top of it you have all the brutality of the disease, and you're not doing, this is not a stroll in the park. And I'm not saying the continental battles were a stroll in the park between France and Prussia and Austria and Russia and everything like that, but realistically, people, in my opinion, don't give the terrain factor enough credit in the Peninsular War. So that's kind of my rant on it. But realistically, what it comes down to, I think, is the specialty and the freedom that were given to Wellington's riflemen to disrupt the French forces as much as they could. The seasons and the terrains, and the fact that the British also had Spanish guerrillas as guides quite often helped them. Sometimes they betrayed them. There were Spanish guerrillas that ended up changing sides and getting paid by the French to betray them. Their ability to limit France's movements across a country that it was struggling to control. I don't necessarily know if this tactic would have worked in France, specifically because most of the locals supported the British, whereas marching through France, it's not going to be the case. They were able to take key ridges and bridges and move quickly. They a battalion, or even that, oftentimes they split up entire battalions of riflemen, but these units of riflemen, they could move at a much faster pace and be trusted to, relatively live off the land. Not quite so much as the entire French army did, and then they controlled the tempo of it, where everywhere else in the world, or everywhere else on the war, for the most part, the French controlled the tempo. When they attacked, they formed columns, not lines, and they just punched their columns through. And you know, they hadn't quite figured out how to do that yet. The Allies hadn't quite figured out how to stop that. You know, lots of Frenchmen were dying, but more would take the place. And those columns, once they broke through, I mean, they won. They simply won. So I really believe, and I'm going to be writing a blog on this, so make sure you check out our website, adventurehistorian.com. But I'm going to be writing a more in-depth article with pictures and maps and things like that. But I really do believe that it was the light infantry, their use of the terrain, and Wellington's willingness, wow, that's really hard to say, Wellington's willingness to give them free rein to conduct operations is what gave them the ability to defeat a French army that had never really tasted defeat at this level since, you know, during any of the wars. So thanks for checking it out today. This is number one. This is something that I'm very passionate about. I'm an education major, served in the military. I was a cavalry scout for 4 years in the U.S. Army. I have lived abroad and traveled abroad for quite a while. My family and I lived in Sicily for a while, and we've got our home base here in Missouri now. But we still travel quite a bit, and we're interested in writing and doing more and just sharing. You know, I'm way more interested in sharing my passion for history, and I had to do something about it other than just talk to my wife about it, because she's probably ready to hang me in the barn for as much as I talk about everything history, especially Napoleon. So thank you guys very much for checking it out. I appreciate it. Like I said, go to adventurehistorian.com. Check us out on YouTube, Facebook, TikTok. We'll be putting clips of this out, and I hope to be doing these every other week. Thanks again. Have a great day. Goodbye.